Hi ladies, welcome to week 3 of class. This week we're going to talk about chapter 5 and 6 from the textbook. The two chapters are quite different from each other. Before I start talking about the reading, I do want to remind you of a couple things. This week you're taking the first quiz. You need to take that by Friday at noon. Also, when you take this quiz, you need to know that as soon as you open it, you have to finish it. You can't pause it. If you try to go back to it, it will just count every question you didn't answer as wrong. So please make sure that you finish the test when you open it. And if you email me saying that you did this, I will have to give you the grade that it assigns you, because I have no way of knowing if you looked at all the questions and then stopped it and went and found all the answers. So anyway, make sure when you start it that you can finish it. You have a set amount of time to take the test in, and it's 45 minutes, so make sure you have that much time. Also, you can use your notes, obviously, but I would highly recommend that you look them over before you start the quiz. Next week, during week 4, you're going to write your first paper and submit that. That's also due on Friday by noon. And if you look in the syllabi, you'll see that there are 4 choices of topics. Each of the papers, whichever topic you pick, needs to be 3 to 4 pages in length. It needs to be a formal paper, so that means you don't really use personal pronouns. It's not about your opinion, but this is based on the research that you do. You're informing us about it. Also, make sure at the paper that you start with an intro, that you don't just jump right into the topic. Your intro should look kind of like this, where it's kind of a broad way of introducing it, then you narrow down to your topic. By the end of the first paragraph, I should know your topic and hopefully your main points. Also, make sure there's also a conclusion. And again, this is 3 to 4 pages in length, and you need 4 outside sources. If you have any questions, just email me. So, chapter 5 is all about the Romans. If you recall, last week we talked about how the book makes the case that the Jewish culture, the Greeks, and the Romans heavily influenced Christianity and the authors of the Bible. So this is a chapter to help you understand a little bit about the Romans. And so, first of all, it will mention lots of different leaders. My understanding of the hierarchy within that culture at the time is that there was an emperor that kind of controlled, well, sometimes there were 2, like they each had half of the empire or just one. And then from there are the kings, and the kings kind of report to the emperor. And then under the kings would be like governors or procurators. And these are people that were more like local leaders, okay? Sort of like how our governors are today, or our mayors, if you will. Anyway, so we talked about Alexander the Great, and you read about Alexander the Great when you read about the Greek culture. After he was the leader, after he left, there were a couple different dynasties, the Ptolemaic rule and the Seleucids. And if you look in the book, there's a good map that helps you kind of see what areas of Alexander's empire they kind of controlled. And they were always battling each other. There was always fighting between them. There was a particular emperor named Antiochus IV, and he persecuted the Jewish people of the time. So there was a revolt led by a person named Judas Maccabeus. This is known as the Maccabean Revolt. And he successfully overthrew Antiochus, and that started the Hasmonean dynasty. And this was a time where the Jewish people, again, retained control of the Promised Land, and they led and had the power. And so they were in charge of the Promised Land from 142 to 63 BCE or BC. BCE refers to before the Common Era. CE is Common Era, which is the equivalent of AD. Anyway, so they're ruling, and along comes this man named John Hyrcanus, and he had a younger brother who had taken his kind of throne, and so he wanted to oust his brother. So he asked the Romans to come in and help him. The Romans came in, helped him oust his brother, but then turned around and gave him the title of both priest and ethnarch. Ethnarch was like a provincial governor. And so basically they demoted him, and he wasn't able to be the king. And they took over the leadership. Then that's kind of how the Romans end up in charge of the Promised Land at the time of Jesus. They sent a military leader named Pompey, and he ousted Aristobulus, who was the brother, and again they demoted John Hyrcanus. So then this kind of begins the Herodian dynasty, And so these were leaders of the promised land before Jesus and through the time of Jesus. And they all had the title Herod and then a name after that. So Herod Antipater was the first of them, and he was the father, patriarch. But his son was Herod the Great, who's very well known, especially thanks to the Bible, because he was the ruler during the time of Jesus. So first he was a governor of Galilee, but then he became the king of Judea. And just for the record, if you look at the maps in the book, you'll see this, but Galilee is kind of in the north, and then there's Samaria, and then there's Judea. And Galilee is where most of the fishermen lived, and it was very kind of simple, kind of blue-collar workers. And then in Judea, this is maybe where the wealthier people lived, and it seemed more important because that's where the Jerusalem temple was. Anyway, he became the king of Judea, and, he was very important at the time. He was the king when Jesus was born, and he had a really impressive building program. He took the Jewish temple and he added on to it, and he called it Herod's temple. And basically what he added onto it were some courtyards, and there was one for men, like Jewish men, one for Jewish women, and then one for Gentile people. And this did increase tourism, and people came who were not Jewish to the temple. But that was a little controversial because the Jewish people felt like, people were worshiping false gods there, and that wasn't okay. He was pretty paranoid and violent. He killed his own wife. He killed some of his own sons because he thought they were trying to overthrow him. When he actually did die, some of his sons were still alive, and the land was then divided up among his sons. So one of his sons' name was Philip, and he became the leader in the north and east of the Sea of Galilee. And then his son Herod Antipas was the ruler in Galilee and Perea, and Herod Archelaus became the ruler in the southern part where Judea and Samaria was. Again, Judea is important because that's where the temple is. Eventually, one of their children, Herod Agrippa I, was the king of Judea and Samaria. He was kind of evil, and I'll talk about all of them for what they're kind of known for. And then Herod Agrippa II took over Philip's area, so the northern area. And when Paul was alive, he almost converted Herod Agrippa II to Christianity. Herod the Great, again, was the ruler at the time of Jesus. He's the one who declared all the baby boys to be killed. Herod Antipas is pretty well known because he was the one who beheaded John the Baptist. And then later, his grandson, I think it was Herod Agrippa I, is the one who beheaded James the Apostle. So they were Jewish people, but they were really more like puppets of the Roman emperors. And they were more loyal to Rome than they were to their Jewish faith. And so even though they appeared to be leading, with the Jewish agenda in mind, that wasn't really the case. The chapter will also talk about a couple of revolts that kind of affected the people of the time. One of them was a revolt led by the Zealots, which I referred to when we talked about Judaism. This happened between 66 and 75 AD or CE. And at the time, Nero was the emperor. Nero is well known for kind of starting Christian persecutions. And his military commander was Vespasian. And so he had Vespasian kind of drive out the Jews from Jerusalem, and in the process destroyed the temple. And also there was a revolt in 132 to 135 AD, and this was known as the Bar Kokhba revolt, and it was led by someone with that name, Bar Kokhba. And he some people thought he was the Messiah, so a lot of people followed him, so he waged a revolt, but also both revolts were huge failures and definitely affected the stature, the influence of Jewish people, and the perception non-Jews had of Jewish people. Jesus, when he was alive, said, "Pay Caesar what is Caesar, pay God what is God's." And really throughout all of this history, that was the big question. How do I live in a country run by a government that doesn't represent my faith, and how can I maintain allegiance to that country as well as my faith? And I think we still grapple with that today. Chapter 6 is all about the Gospels, kind of an overview or a generalization about the Gospels. So here's some things I want you to know about the Gospels. First of all, they, like all the books in the Bible, were written by different people at different times for different audiences with a different agenda. And one thing that's kind of a common theme is today, if you and I were reading a history book, we would expect it to be factually correct. And if it wasn't, that would make the history book seem like it was invalid. But at the time when these gospel writers are writing the story of Jesus, they're not really trying to capture a factual history as much as passing on the religious truth of the story. So they're really focused on more of the spiritual truths than the facts. And so as a result, sometimes they contradict each other when it comes to geography or timeline. But everything they say about Jesus is true, and everything about things Jesus said and did is true. And therefore, again, the focus is on more of a spiritual truth. Another thing that I want you to understand is when it says the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Mark, and so on, that's like saying, I, Julie Van Cat, am writing down everything I know about Barack Obama according to Michelle. Like, she told this to me, I wrote it down. And so we really don't know the people who physically wrote down the Bible or the Gospels in the Bible, but we do have a sense that they were being loyal to the teachings of these apostles or early church leaders. Not all of the gospel evangelists were even apostles. Mark and Luke were not, Matthew and John were. And as you read the chapters, you'll read kind of arguments for why we don't think these people dictated these books, with the exception of possibly John. But in most cases, it's more like a person wants their gospel, their story of Jesus, to have some credibility. The word gospel means good news. So they're passing on the good news about Jesus, and they want people to understand that what they're saying is authentic and accurate because they heard it from someone who was either an eyewitness or a very good source. So 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are known as the Synoptic Gospels. This word means like seen together or similar. And if you do lay these books down side by side and you look at the same stories, you'll see that they're very similar to each other. John's Gospel is 90% unique and was written last. So that kind of makes sense. If you were going to write a 4th account of something other people had written about, you would do that if you had more to add to the story. It's not to say because John doesn't include the stories that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do that their stories are inaccurate. It's more like John's filling in the gaps. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they're so similar, there was a lot of debate and argument and theories about how they came to be so similar. And the basic theory, the one that your book talks about the most and most theologians agree with, is that Mark was written first, and then Matthew and Luke were written kind of around the same time, kind of overlapping times anyway, and not really aware of the other person writing. And there are passages, of course, that are in all 3 Gospels, and when that happens, we call those stories triple tradition. They're in all 3 synoptics. Sometimes there's a story that's called double tradition, and that means it's in 2 of the synoptic Gospels. And oftentimes when a story is double tradition, if you look at it, you'll see that those stories mostly appear in Matthew and Luke. So even though we believe Mark's Gospel was written first and Matthew and Luke used it as a source, that infers that there had to be another source that they both had a copy of, because these stories don't come from Mark, so they had to find them somewhere else, and they weren't sitting side by side writing this together. So we call that source the Q source. And if you look at the book, you'll see some graphics that help you better understand how that would look. But again, we believe, most theologians, that Mark's was written first and that Matthew and Luke's were written second and third. Not sure which one was first. And then John's Gospel definitely written last. The book goes into some biblical criticism, like ways to read and interpret the Bible. And it talks about historical form criticism, redaction criticism, narrative criticism. And when you read the textbook, you'll see what those different types of criticism are, but it's basically looking at the text from a different angle. So make sure that you are familiar with those different types of criticism and that you're understanding what they mean. Again, the book is now going to go into each gospel one at a time, and we're going to spend time on each gospel 1 per week. So the next 4 weeks, I'll be talking about the 4 gospels. Thank you and have a great week.